The funny thing about power is that the loudest people usually have the least of it. I heard the sirens before I saw the cruisers coming over the hill. Out here in West Texas, sound travels different across open land. It rolls through the fences and mesquite trees like distant thunder. I was halfway under a busted gate with a wrench in one hand when the first red and blue reflections flashed across the side of my barn. Dust kicked up behind the sheriff's SUVs as they came down my gravel road fast enough to leave a cloud hanging over the pasture. My horses started pacing near the water trough, nervous from the noise. I stood up slow, wiped grease across my jeans, and looked toward the entrance to my ranch. 3 HOA SUVs were parked behind the deputies like they were part of the operation. Patricia Coleman climbed out first wearing oversized sunglasses and a white blazer that probably cost more than my monthly feed bill. She folded her arms and smiled at me from across the cattle guard like she'd finally won something. Behind her, half the neighborhood stood near the roadside filming with their phones. Some of them were still holding Starbucks cups like they'd rushed over to catch a live show before work. That's when I realized this wasn't just another complaint. Patricia wanted an audience. A young deputy stepped out of the lead cruiser, with one hand resting near his holster. "Ethan Walker," he called out. His boots crunched against the dry gravel as he walked toward me. "Keep your hands where I can see them." I glanced down at the wrench in my hand, then tossed it gently into the dirt beside the gate. The metal hit the ground with a dull clink. Hot wind pushed through the pasture carrying the smell of hay, diesel fuel, and sun-baked cedar. "Problem, officer?" I asked. Patricia answered before he could. "Tell him what he did," she snapped. "Tell him what kind of threat he's been making against this community." Community. That word always sounded funny coming from people who built identical houses on land their grandkids would never know how to work. The deputy kept moving closer. "We received reports of illegal firearms, threats against residents, and barricades placed on county access roads." I almost smiled at that. Barricades. The barricade was an old rusted chain I used to keep teenagers from racing ATVs across my north pasture at night. Patricia pointed toward my barn dramatically, making sure everyone watching could see her hand shaking. "He's unstable," she said loudly. I told the board this man was dangerous. Somewhere behind the cameras, somebody whispered, "Oh my God." The deputy told me to stay where I was while another officer moved around toward the side of the house. Then the final SUV door opened. Sheriff Daniel Reeves stepped out slowly into the heat. The second I saw him, I knew this whole thing was about to go sideways for Patricia Coleman. Reeves adjusted his hat and looked across the pasture toward me. For a moment, he didn't move at all. The wind rattled the old American flag hanging beside my barn. Dust drifted across the road between us. Then his eyes dropped to the faded name patch stitched onto my work jacket, and the color drained right out of his face. People like Patricia Coleman always think silence means weakness. Sheriff Reeves kept staring at me from across the gravel road while the rest of the neighborhood waited for something dramatic to happen. I could feel every phone camera pointed in my direction. The heat coming off the hood of the cruisers made the air shimmer above the pasture fence. One of my horses snorted nervously behind me, stomping against the dry dirt near the trough. Patricia took a few confident steps forward in her high heels like she was already rehearsing the story she planned to tell at the next HOA meeting. "Sheriff," she said loudly, "this is exactly what I warned the county about. He has been intimidating residents for months." Reeves did not answer her. He just kept his eyes locked on me like he was trying to place a memory that had been buried for years. I knew that look. Men who serve together never really forget each other. Sometimes they just hope they never have to remember. The deputy closest to me shifted awkwardly and looked back toward the sheriff for instructions. Nobody spoke for a few long seconds except for the sound of wind rattling the loose tin along my equipment shed. Patricia hated silence. That was one thing I learned about her the first week she moved into the development beside my ranch. She needed noise. Meetings. Complaints. Rules. Emails sent at 2 in the morning. She built her whole life around making sure somebody else felt smaller than she did. 6 months earlier, this land had been quiet. Just cattle fences, open sky, and 37 acres my father left me before he passed. Then the developers came. Within a year, they carved up the neighboring fields into neat little suburban lots with fake stone entry signs and matching mailboxes every 50 feet. They named it Copper Ridge Estates even though there was no ridge and no copper anywhere near the place. The first time Patricia showed up at my gate, she had a clipboard tucked under one arm and a smile so polished it looked painful. She introduced herself as president of the new HOA board and spent 10 minutes talking about community standards while staring at my barn like it personally offended her. At the end of the conversation, she handed me a printed packet thick enough to stop a bullet. Noise regulations. Fence restrictions. Exterior paint recommendations. Livestock visibility concerns. I remember laughing softly and asking her if she understood she was standing on a working ranch in West Texas. Her smile disappeared immediately after that. From then on, the complaints started rolling in every week like clockwork. Apparently my horses smelled too strong on humid days. My tractor made too much noise before 8 in the morning. Dust from my north trail drifted too close to their jogging path. One woman even filed a complaint because my American flagpole created an aggressive atmosphere. I wish I was joking about that. I ignored most of it because men my age learn something important eventually. Some battles cost more energy than they are worth. But Patricia took my silence personally. She wanted arguments. She wanted me angry. Instead, every time she showed up at my property line with another violation notice, I just nodded once and went back to work. That drove her absolutely crazy. The deputy near me cleared his throat nervously. "Sheriff," he asked again. Reeves finally moved. Slow. Careful. Like a man walking toward a ghost. You can tell a lot about people by what bothers them. Patricia Coleman was not bothered by crime, corruption, or dishonest contractors. She was bothered by the sight of an old ranch sitting beside her perfect little neighborhood, like a reminder that the world existed before her homeowners association did. Sheriff Reeves stopped about 10 feet away from me, close enough to see the sweat and dust on my jacket. His eyes stayed fixed on the faded name patch stitched over my chest. Walker. The letters were cracked from years under the sun. Patricia looked confused by the silence building around us. "Sheriff," she asked again, forcing a nervous laugh this time. "Do you know him or something?" Reeves ignored her completely. He glanced past me toward the barn, then toward the old windmill near the north fence line. I could almost see the memories moving behind his eyes. Some men remember places by landmarks. Others remember them by the people who kept them alive long enough to come home. The deputy near my truck shifted uncomfortably and lowered his voice. "Sir, should we secure the property?" Reeves still did not answer. Patricia stepped forward before anybody else could speak. "This man has been harassing residents for months," she snapped. He blocked access to the trail easement and threatened one of the landscaping crews. That last part was not even close to true. What actually happened was one of her contractors drove a bulldozer straight through my southern fence 2 weeks earlier because they wanted faster access to the construction site behind the subdivision. I found 3 calves wandering half a mile down County Road 8 after sunrise because of that stunt. When I confronted the crew foreman, I told him if he crossed my fence line again without permission, the county sheriff would be hearing from my lawyer before sunset. Apparently, Patricia translated that into a threat. That was her favorite trick. Turn boundaries into aggression. Turn silence into hostility. Turn anybody who refused to kneel into a villain. I looked past the cruisers toward Copper Ridge Estates sitting behind its decorative stone walls and perfectly trimmed lawns. Even from half a mile away, I could see the rows of identical rooftops glowing under the afternoon sun. 6 months ago, that land had wild grass taller than a truck tire and enough coyotes to keep you awake all night during winter. My father used to ride horseback through those fields every spring checking fence posts after heavy storms. Now there was a yoga studio and a dog spa sitting where cattle used to graze. Progress, I guess. Patricia noticed me looking toward the neighborhood and mistook it for intimidation. "See," she said quickly to the deputies. "That is the look he gives people. I told you he is unstable." One of the women filming near the gate nodded dramatically like she was part of some true crime documentary. I almost laughed. The crazy part was how badly they needed me to become the character they invented in their heads. The angry rancher. The bitter old cowboy who hated newcomers. But anger takes energy, and after a certain age, you stop wasting energy on people who have never carried real weight in their lives. Reeves finally spoke, his voice low and careful. "Mrs. Coleman," he said without looking away from me, "who exactly filed the emergency report this morning?" Patricia straightened immediately. "I did." Reeves nodded once. Slow. Thoughtful. Then he asked the question that changed the entire temperature of the afternoon. "And did you personally witness Mr. Walker threaten anyone?" The moment Patricia hesitated, I knew Sheriff Reeves had already figured out more than she wanted him to. The wind kept pushing dust across the road in little spirals around our boots, while the entire neighborhood stood frozen behind their phone cameras, waiting for somebody to say something dramatic. Patricia cleared her throat and lifted her chin like she was trying to recover control of the room she thought she owned. "Several residents witnessed threatening behavior," she said carefully. "We have all felt unsafe around him for months." Reeves nodded slowly, but his expression never changed. "That was not my question." Her confidence slipped just enough for me to notice. People like Patricia survive on momentum. The second that momentum breaks, panic starts leaking through the cracks. One of the deputies near the gate lowered his hand from his belt and glanced toward the sheriff again, unsure whether this was still an emergency or just another neighborhood dispute blown out of proportion. Reeves took another slow step toward me. Up close, I could see the years on his face now. More gray in his beard than I remembered. A scar near his jaw I did not think he had before. Time catches all of us eventually. "How long has it been, Captain?" he asked quietly. The second that word left his mouth, the atmosphere changed. Not loudly. Not dramatically. Just enough. Like the pressure dropping before a storm. Patricia blinked hard. "Captain," one of the women near the roadside whispered. I looked at Reeves for a long moment before answering. "About 18 years, I said. Give or take." The younger deputies looked back and forth between us, confused. Patricia forced out an awkward laugh. "I do not understand what that has to do with this situation." Reeves finally turned toward her, and for the first time since arriving, his eyes lost that distant look. "It has everything to do with this situation, ma'am." Nobody spoke after that. Even the horses behind me had gone still. You could hear the old windmill creaking out near the fence line and the soft ticking of hot engines cooling under the Texas sun. Patricia crossed her arms tighter. "Sheriff, with all due respect, this man has refused every reasonable request from the Homeowners Association. He blocks contractors, ignores community regulations, and deliberately intimidates residents." I almost smiled at the word residents. Half those people moved here less than a year ago and acted like they discovered Texas themselves. Reeves looked toward the north pasture where fresh tire tracks still cut across the dirt from the contractor that tore through my fence last week. "Did your contractors have permission to enter his property?" he asked. Patricia opened her mouth, then stopped. That told him everything he needed to know. One of the deputies shifted awkwardly and quietly stepped farther away from my barn. The energy around the cruisers changed fast after that. Nobody rushed anymore. Nobody acted tough. Suddenly, everybody seemed more interested in avoiding mistakes than making arrests. Patricia realized it too. I could see it in the way she kept glancing around at the people filming. She came here expecting a public takedown. Instead, the story was slipping away from her inch by inch. Reeves looked back at me again, and there was something heavy behind his eyes now. Memory. Regret. Respect. Maybe all three. "I heard you left the service after Fallujah," he said quietly. "Nobody could find you after that." A dry gust of wind rolled through the pasture, carrying the smell of dirt, leather, and rain somewhere far off beyond the hills. I looked down at the dust around my boots before answering. That was the idea. There are some memories a man buries so deep he almost forgets they are still alive until somebody else says their name out loud. The second Reeves mentioned Fallujah, the air around us changed completely. The deputies stopped treating me like a threat and started studying me like they had walked into a story halfway through. Patricia noticed it too, and I could practically see the panic building behind her eyes. She had spent months turning me into a villain for the neighborhood. Now that image was cracking apart right in front of her audience. "Sheriff," she interrupted sharply, "with all respect, I failed to see what military history has to do with multiple complaints from homeowners." Reeves finally turned toward her fully. "Because false emergency calls waste county resources," he said calmly. "And because context matters." Patricia folded her arms tighter. "So now we are excusing threatening behavior because somebody used to wear a uniform." I let out a slow breath through my nose and looked past her toward the subdivision. Sprinklers clicked rhythmically across perfect green lawns while sunlight bounced off rows of oversized windows. Everything over there looked polished from a distance. But I had spent enough time around people to know polished things usually crack the easiest. "Nobody threatened anybody," I said quietly. Patricia snapped toward me immediately. "Your exact words to my contractor were, and I quote, 'You do not want to find out what happens next.'" Several people behind her nodded dramatically. Reeves looked at me. "Did you say that?" "Yep." Patricia smiled instantly like she had finally trapped me. Reeves asked the next question without changing expression. "What happened before that?" Silence hit again. Patricia hated silence because silence gave people time to think. I looked toward the broken section of fence near the south pasture where fresh boards still leaned crooked against the dirt. "3 calves got loose after her contractor drove through my fence," I said. "One nearly wandered onto Route 16 before sunrise." One deputy quietly muttered, "Jesus," under his breath. Reeves kept his eyes on Patricia. Did your company report property damage? Patricia hesitated again. That is not the issue here. Actually, Reeves replied calmly, that sounds exactly like the issue. A hot gust rolled across the ranch hard enough to shake dust from the barn roof. Somewhere off near the tree line, wind chimes clinked softly outside my porch. For a moment, nobody spoke. Then one of the women filming lowered her phone slightly and asked Patricia, "Wait, your contractors hit his fence." Patricia turned immediately defensive. It was an accident during development access adjustments. Development access adjustments. That was the kind of phrase people used when they wanted to make bad behavior sound expensive. Reeves rubbed his jaw slowly before looking back at me. You still keeping records like before? He asked. I nodded once toward the barn. Patricia frowned. Records of what? I did not answer her. Reeves already knew. Back overseas, I documented everything. Coordinates. Supply routes. Equipment logs. Incident reports. Men like me learned early that details keep people alive and protect them later when somebody higher up starts rewriting the truth. Patricia suddenly looked much less comfortable standing in the middle of my ranch. Sheriff, she said carefully now, I really think this situation has become unnecessarily personal. Reeves gave a short, dry laugh at that. Ma'am, he said, you brought 6 patrol units to a cattle ranch over a property dispute and an old chain across a dirt road. One of the deputies near the cruisers actually looked embarrassed. Patricia opened her mouth again, but Reeves lifted one hand slightly and stopped her without raising his voice. Then he looked back at me and asked quietly, Captain Walker, do you still have the footage? The truth scares people more when it is organized. Patricia tried to recover fast after Reeves mentioned footage. This is ridiculous, she said sharply. We are standing out here discussing security cameras while this man has been terrorizing residents. Reeves did not even look at her. Captain Walker, he repeated calmly, do you still have the footage? I nodded once toward the barn. Every second of it. The wind shifted again, carrying the smell of rain and dry cedar through the pasture. One of the horses brushed against the fence behind me, metal clinking softly under the afternoon sun. Reeves glanced toward the deputies. Nobody enters the property, he said firmly. Nobody touches anything. That sentence alone changed the entire scene. 30 minutes earlier, they showed up expecting an arrest. Now they were treating my ranch like protected ground. Patricia noticed it instantly. Sheriff, this is completely inappropriate, she snapped. You are allowing personal history to interfere with an active investigation. Reeves finally turned toward her with the patience of a man trying very hard not to embarrass somebody in public. Ma'am, right now the only thing I see is a civil property dispute escalated into a false emergency response. The woman filming near the gate slowly lowered her phone all the way down. A couple standing near the HOA SUVs exchanged nervous looks. It was amazing how quickly confidence disappeared once people realized they might end up on the wrong side of the story. I walked toward the barn slowly, boots crunching over gravel while every eye followed me. The big sliding door groaned when I pulled it open. Cool air rolled out carrying the smell of old wood, machine oil, leather tack, and dust. Sunlight cut through the high windows in long golden beams across the concrete floor. Reeves stepped inside behind me while the deputies stayed near the entrance. Patricia tried to follow, but one deputy politely blocked her path. Please stay outside, ma'am. That probably upset her more than anything else that happened all day. I crossed the barn toward a steel workbench near the back wall. Above it hung old horseshoes, faded rodeo photos, and a small American flag folded neatly inside a wooden case. Reeves stopped walking when he saw it. His expression changed again, softer this time. "You kept it," he said quietly. "Some things matter," I answered. I opened the metal cabinet beneath the workbench and pulled out a thick binder along with a hard drive labeled by date. Patricia was still visible through the open barn doors, arguing with one of the deputies outside, her white blazer glowing bright under the Texas sun like a distress flare. Reeves looked down at the binders stacked inside the cabinet and let out a low breath. "You documented everything." "I learned a long time ago that memory alone does not protect you," I said. He gave a slow nod because he understood exactly what I meant. I handed him the hard drive first. "South fence camera," I said. 3 angles. Time-stamped. Reeves passed it to one of the deputies, who immediately walked it back toward the cruiser laptop. A few minutes later, the deputy's voice suddenly crackled over the radio from outside. "Sheriff, you need to see this." Everybody near the barn entrance turned toward the patrol vehicle. Even Patricia stopped arguing. Reeves walked outside slowly while I stayed near the doorway with dust swirling around my boots. The laptop screen reflected across their faces as the footage played. Grainy nighttime video showed the contractor truck cutting straight through my fence line before sunrise while workers dragged equipment across my pasture without permission. Then Patricia's voice appeared clearly on audio from another camera angle. "Just move it," she said impatiently. "He will complain either way." The silence after that felt heavier than thunder. Nothing exposes arrogance faster than hearing your own voice played back at the wrong moment. The group standing near the patrol cruiser went completely silent as Patricia's words echoed from the laptop speakers again. "Just move it. He will complain either way." Nobody said a thing after that. Even the wind seemed quieter. Reeves stared at the screen for another few seconds before slowly closing the laptop halfway. One of the deputies looked genuinely uncomfortable now, like he wanted to disappear from the entire situation. Patricia stepped forward quickly, forcing out a strained laugh. "That recording is completely out of context." Reeves looked at her calmly. "Then I would strongly recommend you explain the context carefully." She opened her mouth, but stopped when she realized every camera around her was still recording. The same audience she brought here to humiliate me was now watching her unravel in real time. I stayed near the barn doorway while sunlight stretched long shadows across the gravel. Dust floated through the air like smoke in the late afternoon heat. Reeves turned toward me again, and this time there was no uncertainty left in his face. "Just respect." Heavy and quiet. "I heard rumors after you disappeared," he said softly. "Nobody knew where you went." I leaned one shoulder against the barn frame. "That was intentional." He nodded slowly. "Most of the men still talk about what happened over there." Patricia interrupted sharply, desperate to regain control. "Sheriff, this is not some military reunion. This is a homeowner's safety issue." Reeves looked at her with the kind of patience people use on someone who still does not realize the conversation already ended. "Mrs. Coleman," he said carefully, "do you know who Captain Walker is?" She folded her arms immediately. "I know he is a difficult neighbor." Reeves actually shook his head slightly at that. "No, ma'am. You do not." One of the deputies standing nearby straightened a little, suddenly paying closer attention. Reeves looked back toward the pasture before speaking again. 18 years ago, outside Fallujah, my convoy got trapped after dark during an evacuation route collapse. The entire roadside crowd went silent again. Even Patricia stopped talking. Reeves continued in the same calm voice. Communication systems failed. Visibility was gone. We lost direction completely. He glanced toward me briefly. Captain Walker walked half a mile through open terrain in the middle of that chaos to get us out. I looked away toward the fence line while he spoke because I never liked hearing old stories retold in public. Reeves did not dramatize anything. That was what made it feel real. A lot of us came home because of him, he finished quietly. One of the younger deputies stared at me differently after that. Not fear. Not admiration exactly either. Just understanding. Patricia looked around nervously now, realizing the emotional ground underneath her had completely collapsed. That still does not excuse harassment, she muttered weakly. Reeves let out the faintest breath through his nose. Ma'am, from what I have seen today, the only documented harassment here has been against him. That hit harder than if he had raised his voice. Patricia's face lost color immediately. Behind her, a couple of homeowners slowly stepped away from the HOA vehicles like they suddenly did not want to be associated with any of this anymore. Reeves took one final step toward me. Then, right there in front of the deputies, the cameras, the HOA board members, and every person Patricia brought to watch me fail, Sheriff Daniel Reeves stood tall, squared his shoulders, and gave me a formal salute. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. All you could hear was the sound of the wind crossing the pasture while Patricia Coleman realized she had just tried to publicly destroy the wrong man. Respect has a strange way of silencing people who were loud just seconds earlier. After Sheriff Reeves saluted me, nobody around the cruisers seemed to know where to look anymore. The same homeowners who showed up expecting handcuffs and drama suddenly found themselves standing in awkward silence under the Texas sun, pretending they had not spent the last hour filming a man they barely understood. Patricia looked completely lost now. Her posture changed first. Then her voice. Even the way she held herself started shrinking little by little. That is the thing about fake authority. It disappears the second real authority walks into the room. Reeves lowered his hand slowly and looked toward the deputies. Turn off the emergency response status, he said calmly. This incident is now being documented as a property and false reporting investigation. One of the deputies immediately radioed dispatch, while another quietly stepped away from Patricia like he no longer wanted to stand beside her. She noticed that too. Sheriff, this is insane, she said, trying one last time to regain control. You cannot seriously be turning this against the Homeowners Association. Reeves answered without emotion. No, ma'am. Your own actions did that. The late afternoon light stretched across the ranch in long golden lines, while dust drifted around the tires of the parked SUVs. Somewhere out near the north fence, one of my horses let out a low, restless breath. I watched the entire scene from the barn entrance without saying much because there was nothing left to prove. People usually expose themselves once they realize nobody is afraid of them anymore. Patricia looked toward the homeowners standing behind her, searching for support, but most of them would not even meet her eyes now. A couple quietly got back into their vehicles. One man wearing a golf polo muttered something about needing to get home before dinner and left without another word. Funny how fast loyalty disappears when legal liability enters the conversation. Reeves walked back toward me while one of the deputies carried the hard drive evidence carefully inside an evidence bag. There is more, I said quietly. Reeves gave me a tired look like he already knew. I walked back into the barn and opened the lower cabinet again. Inside were neatly labeled folders stacked beside county land maps and printed complaint records. Every notice Patricia ever sent me. Every trespassing report. Every contractor violation. Every late-night drone recording hovering over my property line. I handed Reeves another folder. "Start with the survey maps," I said. He opened the first page and immediately frowned. They pushed past the easement boundary. "By almost 11 feet," I answered. One deputy let out a low whistle after hearing that. Patricia stepped forward quickly. Those development lines were temporary markers. I looked directly at her for the first time all afternoon. "No," I said calmly. "They were expensive mistakes." Her face tightened instantly because deep down she already knew I was right. Reeves flipped through more pages while the homeowners nearby watched in uncomfortable silence. "You documented drone activity too?" he asked. I nodded once. 3 separate incidents after midnight. One deputy quietly shook his head. "That is not going to look good in court." Patricia's confidence finally cracked completely after hearing that word. Court. Not HOA meetings. Not complaint forms. Real consequences. Real investigations. Real records. Reeves closed the folder carefully and looked at her with the same calm expression he had worn all day. "Mrs. Coleman," he said, "I strongly recommend you contact legal counsel before speaking further." That landed harder than any threat ever could. The hot wind rolled across the pasture again while the American flag beside my barn snapped sharply overhead. Patricia stood there speechless, surrounded by the same crowd she brought to witness my humiliation, only now every camera was pointed in the opposite direction. By the end of that week, half the neighborhood stopped making eye contact with me. Not because they were afraid. Because shame makes people uncomfortable in quiet places. News traveled fast through Copper Ridge Estates after the Sheriff Department opened a formal investigation into the false emergency report and the easement violations. Turns out county officials get very interested when developers push property lines past legal boundaries and homeowners associations start weaponizing law enforcement over personal grudges. Funny how quickly polished communities lose their shine once attorneys and surveyors get involved. 2 weeks later, county crews arrived at sunrise and placed bright orange markers all along the disputed edge of my ranch. I watched them from horseback while cold morning air rolled across the pasture carrying the smell of wet dirt and cedar after an overnight storm. One of the surveyors shook his head while reviewing the maps. "They crossed farther than we expected," he said quietly. 11 feet became 14 in some sections. Every extra inch cost somebody money. Patricia stopped showing up after that. Word around town was the HOA board hired outside counsel, then immediately started blaming each other once the invoices arrived. 3 board members resigned before the end of the month. One family listed their house for sale before summer even started. Amazing how fast community values disappear once special assessments hit 6 figures. As for Patricia, the last time I saw her in person was outside the county records office. No white blazer. No crowd behind her. No confidence. Just one exhausted woman carrying a cardboard file box to her SUV while avoiding everybody's eyes. She glanced at me once across the parking lot, but said nothing. There was nothing left to say. Some defeats happen loudly. Others happen in complete silence. Mine happened quietly too. A month after the investigation started, I finally repaired the last section of fence along the south pasture. Fresh cedar posts stood clean against the open land while late afternoon sunlight stretched gold across the hills. The horses settled back into their routines. The nights got quiet again. No drones. No complaints taped to my gate. No SUVs parked outside filming my property. Just windmills turning slow beneath the Texas sky like they had for decades before any subdivision existed. One evening near sunset, I was tightening wire along the north fence line when I heard tires crunch softly against gravel behind me. Sheriff Reeves stepped out of his truck carrying 2 cups of coffee from the gas station down the highway. He handed me one without saying much and leaned against the fence beside me. We stood there in silence for a while, watching the sun drop low over the pasture. Orange light rolled across the land in waves, catching the old American flag beside the barn as it moved gently in the wind. Reeves finally spoke first. "You know," he said quietly, "most men would have gone after revenge." I took a slow sip of coffee and looked out across the ranch my father left me. "No," I answered. "Most men just want peace." He nodded like he understood exactly what I meant. Before leaving, Reeves stopped beside his truck and looked back toward me one last time. Then he gave me another salute. Smaller this time. Personal. Not for the crowd. Not for the deputies. Just between 2 old men who remembered things most people never would. I nodded back once as the truck disappeared down the gravel road into the fading light. The wind moved softly through the pasture around me while the sun disappeared behind the hills, and for the first time in a long while, the ranch felt like home again.